We're going to kind of tag team between myself and Lama Liz. I'm going to introduce myself and she's going to introduce herself, and then we'll just begin to dialogue. We'll entertain questions at the end. So first, I want to thank my biodiversity folks for inviting me back as a spiritual voice to this conference. And I thank you for adding more voices to the choir. I also want to give a big shout out to my Spirit of Resilience crew for pivoting to join this campaign. They're leading a live tweeting session that's going on. So if you use the hashtags, let's see, Bio for Climate and Blessed Unrest, Divine Feminine and Spirit of Resilience, you should be able to find us online. So I wanted to introduce myself by sharing 4 moments in time when the Divine Feminine revealed herself to me. I began reading and understanding the Bible at 8 years old, and I remember wondering, what is this thing between God and the Holy Spirit? And the Holy Spirit said to me, I'm a she. Oh, well then it made all the sense in the world that she and God produced a Christ child. The second time the Divine Feminine revealed herself to me was as Hokmah, a Lady Wisdom in Proverbs 8. I was studying theology at Howard University Divinity School, and I used Lady Wisdom to choreograph a community dance that represented how does the Divine Feminine reside with us in daily life. And then when I entered formal ministry, the Divine Feminine revealed herself to me as heart intelligence when I pastored an interfaith meditation community for 10 years in the DC area. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. And then finally, the fourth movement, our moment, is when the Divine Feminine revealed herself to me as Mother Nature when I was working on family land in Virginia. It was in nature that I received the call to do this work, so we can thank the Divine Feminine for this moment we're having together. And as I was doing field research and pilot projects up and down the Eastern Seaboard for 7 years, I discovered that the Divine Feminine was really necessary for the mental health of climate activists. The Divine Feminine was necessary for sustainable earth care. And I'm totally convinced as a 6th-generation activist minister that we will not have justice until we replace Mother Nature at the center of the environmental movement. So, Lama Liz, tell us, who are you?
Well, I just first wanted to express my gratitude for being invited to participate in this panel today, and also my gratitude to Reverend Dele for our fun and insightful conversations while we were thinking about what we might want to talk about with all of you. I feel a little bit like I'm probably parachuting in from another world on some level, but I hope that with what I have to say, that you'll see that it's not so different really from the kind of work that many of you are engaged in, just with a slightly different emphasis and focus. So my name is Elizabeth Monson, and I've been studying, practicing, and teaching Tibetan Buddhism for over 30 years. I'm the spiritual co-director of an organization based in Massachusetts called Natural Dharma Fellowship, and I'm the managing teacher at a Buddhist meditation retreat center in northern New Hampshire called Wonderwell Mountain Refuge. My focus, I think, though, in my life, long before I even knew anything about Buddhism, I didn't grow up as a Buddhist, and it wasn't part of my worldview at all as a young person. But what was part of my life on a very significant level was the natural world. And I spent much of my time in the White Mountains in New Hampshire, living up there, working for the Appalachian Mountain Club. The natural world was essentially my spiritual world. And it was where I went to find a sense of presence, and a sense of being, and a sense of wholeness, and a sense of wellness, and even a sense of mystery. And always I felt in the natural world that there was a kind of openness and spaciousness and awareness that superseded the personal individual conceptual ideas about that I was taught to think about my world and about my relationship with the natural world. So when I encountered the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, I was not at all actually surprised to find that I had a very strong affinity for, in particular, the ways in which much of the philosophy and practices of Tibetan Buddhism go hand in hand with the natural world. In fact, they've even been, you could say that they arose specifically from the natural world. There are many yogic practices that came out of or were developed out of the practitioner's intimate connection with the natural world. And so when one engages in those practices, they are a confirmation, a reconfirmation, and a reintegration with essentially the inseparability between the human life and the life of the environment, shall we say. And as far as the notion of divine feminine, I think this is why we really landed on this, that there, within Tibetan Buddhism in particular, the divine feminine refers very specifically to that kind of an interconnectedness with the natural world, and particularly with working with energy. And I'll say more about that when we get to that part of our presentation. So,
Well,
I wanted to just, can I just say one more thing, Reverend Dele? I also wanted to say that, you know, I even though I began in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition very much as a kind of a young person seeking to find a spiritual path that made sense, because much of what I had encountered did not make much sense to me. I also felt that I needed a background that was more based in a kind of more academic study of the tradition. So I do have a PhD in Buddhist studies, actually religious studies with a focus in Buddhist studies from Harvard University. And I find that the two approaches, the sort of contemplative approach and the more academic approach, really help me to express these teachings and this connection with the divine feminine in a way that I hope is more accessible to many people than if it were only coming out of the contemplative tradition. So that's
I think that's what we're here to talk about today, is balancing the way we interact with each other and the way we interact within this movement, so that we don't think it's foreign to combine that intuitive heart knowledge with the head knowledge, that, goes straight forward, and the other knowledge that kind of weaves around. So we wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about, well, what is this thing called divine feminine? It's not like that's something you talk about at the grocery store, at the barber shop. So Lama Liz, why don't you go first? Tell us, what's your definition of the divine feminine?
Okay, I will do that. It's interesting that being with this group, with all of you, and I was listening in earlier to some of the question and answers with Florence. The Buddhist tradition has a very different paradigm for understanding what reality is. And yet, as this modern technological age has developed more and more, we've discovered that a lot of the scientific discoveries about the nature of reality are very much in line with what these different Tibetan yogis and yoginis discovered through their own meditation practice, and in fact, identical in many ways. So in the tantric tradition of Tibetan Buddhism, the notion of the divine feminine refers to particular energies that are present in all living beings, but that are underused and underdeveloped, that they haven't been brought forward very much in the ways in which this tradition has unfolded. It's been very much a patriarchal sort of guided tradition for many hundreds of years. But specifically, the primary energy of the divine feminine in Tibetan Buddhism is known as wisdom. And yet this wisdom has multiple manifestations that are intimately tied to the 5 elements of earth, water, fire, wind, and space. And these energies represent, or these wisdoms, you could say, are non-conceptual. They are wisdoms that we say express the truth of things as they are. And what I mean by that is that generally we live in a world that is populated by and constructed through concepts, through ideas and thoughts and hopes and fears and beliefs. And you could say on some level, we live in a kind of conceptual bubble. And we seldom see or experience things actually as they are, by which I mean devoid of the filter of the thinking mind and its predominant framework of I or me. So in the tantric view of Tibetan Buddhism, which is the Buddhism of the Himalayan regions, the idea is that all of the energies present in the universe are basically good or pure in the sense of being primordially unbiased. They are not filtered through self-centered agendas or stories or beliefs or the perspective of the thinking being. But instead, when we invoke the energy of the divine feminine in this tradition, it's wisdom that sees things as they are. It reminds us that there is actually much more to our experience than simply what we think about things. And so I'll tell you a very short story as a kind of way to provide an example of what I'm talking about. There's a story in this tradition of two Tibetan masters, one of whom I knew quite well. And they were sitting together on the side of a mountain in Colorado and looking down over the slope in front where there was an aspen tree, a very large aspen tree that was glittering in the wind and the sunlight. And they sat there for a very long time in silence together until finally one of them leaned over to the other one and said, pointing at the tree, said, "They call that a tree." And the two of them absolutely burst out laughing, and they just laughed and laughed and laughed. They thought it was hysterical. And the point to this story, the reason why these two masters were laughing, is that from the perspective of the non-conceptual realm of reality, you could say, no amount of intellectual or conceptual reasoning or designation or labeling can ever capture the fullness of our human experiences and our interaction with the natural world. That there's a sense that life is constantly overflowing the boundaries of what we think or believe and opening us, as if we're available, to a more resonant, harmonious, and respectful relationship to the natural world. So the energy of the divine feminine in this context encourages us to recognize that in fact, we are far beyond this isolated idea of
Well, hello, Andrew Walsh, my friend. Do you have a second?
I think somebody needs to mute themselves.
Okay, I just have a quick question. The arrow on my computer is frozen. I'm on a Zoom call, and I clicked on this thing that says share, and my little arrow, I can't get it to move or anything. What can I do to get it to move or reactivate it?
Can someone help them?
Pardon?
Yes, I don't have the
I see
technological
Barbara
expertise for that,
Popolo
but
needs some assistance. I think we need all of the.
Hi.
Hi, is that Ray?
Yes.
Ray, can you mute yourself?
I've tried to mute myself, and I can't.
That's his problem.
I can't get the mute to go on, and my arrow's frozen on share. So, and I haven't been able to watch the screen stuff. So I was just trying to call a friend to see, but I'll be glad to go on mute. I clicked it, my arrow's frozen on share, and I don't know how to get it off, reactivate my arrow and try to get it on mute.
Someone says maybe restart the computer.
Oh, but I have to be able to turn off the computer, restart. But how do I turn my computer off?
Oh dear, you really, oh boy, unplug it.
Well, it's a laptop.
Is whoever the host of this meeting able to mute the whole
Okay,
group?
just a second. Okay.
Yeah, push the button.
I'm gonna walk away from my computer and try to take care of it.
Push the button in the upper right corner and hold it down.
Oh, don't you love it?
Right. Isn't this supposed to be called Blessed Unrest?
That's exactly what we have. We are having an authentic experience.
Okay,
Do you have more to share about your definition, or?
I did. I had just a little bit more to say.
Okay, go ahead. Just
Okay.
go for it.
All right. So essentially where I was coming to was that when we invoke the energy of the divine feminine, when we invoke this kind of a wisdom that sees beyond the limits of what we think and what the beliefs and ideas we have, that we begin to recognize that not one of us is independent, alone, or separate. But the truth is that we are products of these complex interactions and relationships, none of which is more powerful than our interconnectedness with the natural world. And if we miss this more, that we are, that others are, that the world is, then we live on the margins of our lives. And we don't live in the fullness of this human existence. We are out of tune. And in Tibetan, there's a term that is very often used called tunpa, which sounds quite familiar, right? But they say that mi tunpa means to become out of tune, out of harmony, living in a way that is divorced from the basic ground of what is. So in Tantric Buddhism, and this is my final statement, invoking the energy of the divine feminine is a means of returning us to a relationship with the natural world that acknowledges our dependence in a matrix of constantly changing elements that are as much me as anything else. So I think maybe I'll stop there because I want
I like that. You want to stop on the out of tune note and bringing us back into harmony. I really love listening to Lama Liz talk because she creates these wonderful concepts that I see myself already working in. And so a lot of what I have to share will be kind of content poured into that mold. I wanted to give a religious reflection first and then a personal one. First of all, just a reminder that all of the Abrahamic religions, the Hebrew, Christian, Islamic traditions, we all share the same story, particularly in what we call the Old Testament of the Bible, might be called Torah, Quran, but it's the same story. And I just want to lift up two movements of the divine feminine that relate to what we're talking about. The divine feminine written into the Bible is Ruach, or the feminine verb for the Holy Spirit, and Chokmah, the Hebrew name for Lady Wisdom. And in the text, we see that Lady Wisdom is embodied in nature with a very intimate and a very joyful relationship with God. And that tells me that a joyful relationship with God, a joyful relationship with the planet is our birthright. We're not meant to be in crisis with the planet. And it's really up to us. We have the dominion, or we have the authority to actually fix it. So this is, the divine feminine is within us, and it's also our agency to work. So on the personal level, for me, the word divine refers to that internal part of within all of us that never dies. And the word feminine describes the qualities of how that divine presence shows up in our thoughts and in our actions. So when the divine is feminine, she's circular in logic, and she's inclusive in our social and economic systems. The divine feminine is nurturing in our personal and in our family lives. And bringing this down home into the movement that we're talking about today, in the climate movement, the divine feminine operates as balance. She is that nurturing retreat for battle-weary activists. So those of us doing meditation retreats, that is part of the climate movement, because human beings create the climate. So we cannot fight the climate. We can't fight climate change because you're only fighting yourself. You've created this. So to be in a position where we are so out of tune, as Lama Liz has said, that we don't recognize that we're fighting ourselves, that's really a very serious spiritual malaise, and it's a spiritual identity problem. So the divine feminine balances the illogic of our existing food system, and she gives us regenerative agriculture, because the earth naturally regenerates when we follow it. The divine feminine directs our intuition into energy systems that do not extract minerals from the earth. In summation, the divine feminine is kind of like a mother who balances children who have opposite personalities. We want the technology and we want the earth. We have to find that middle place to live. Too far in either direction, and we self-destruct, as I think we're seeing now. So I wanted to ask Lama Liz, how does the divine feminine show up in your work?
Thank you, Reverend Dele. I love what you just said. And this has been a very interesting and fruitful conversation for us in discussing, between these different spiritual traditions, how the divine feminine manifests. So let me just say that in Tibetan Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism, or Buddhism really in general, is at root a very practical tradition that is working to help human beings discover aspects of their being that may have, that living on the surface of our lives in this kind of thought bubble that I described, keep us from really noticing or seeing or being able to live from. And in that sense, then we are out of harmony with the larger world as it is and with the natural world. So a lot of the work I do is not necessarily in the realm of activism as we think of it in the political sphere or in the social world, but the work that I do has to do with training people who come to our centers in how to access within themselves the different energies of the divine feminine, which, by the way, the divine feminine in Tibetan Buddhism, it's the notion of these so-called feminine energies is that every single human being possesses them in equal measure. It's not that women have more of them and men have less of them or anything like that. It's just simply that these energies have not been as developed and brought to the surface, the feminine energies. So part of the work that I do is to really train people in going deeply within themselves, beginning to access parts of themselves that they may never have known were there. And then through that to begin to see that in fact they are not separate from the natural world. I take people into the natural world. We do programs that spend whole days outside in the mountains near the rivers and lakes of northern New Hampshire. And we meditate on the elements being particular manifestations of the divine feminine energies. And trying to help people to begin to explore the inseparability between their emotional and psychological energies and the energies that are already present in the natural world. We also host what we call eco-sattva programs. There's a concept in Buddhism called the bodhisattva. The bodhisattva is a being who has pledged to practice and to live their lives for the benefit of others, so that anything they do on the course of development is done for the purpose of being able to be of more benefit in the world and less in the way of oneself. In other words, less hijacked by emotional reactivity or habitual patterns of thought and behavior. So the idea of the eco-sattva is that this is a person who has pledged themselves to work on themselves, to work on and to be in the realm of activism, political, social activism, in order to benefit the natural world. So we call them eco-sattvas. And we have a number of programs where people come and we work with, specifically with really the emotional content of facing into the truth of the climate emergency. And then from there into different ways of working with those emotional energies, making them manageable, discovering how to become productive within these experiences rather than paralyzed, and providing sources for resilience and strength and creativity in order for people to feel that they can go out into the world, so to speak, and act, be present, act in the different ways that so many of you are already acting without being held back by unknown or undiscovered or we might say just habitual ways of being that have previously maybe crippled or at least significantly reduced the amount of effectability that a person can have in the world. So that's really the way that the divine feminine shows up in my work, is that I'm trying to bring people into more of a clearly experienced, directly experienced sense of their penetration, interseparability with the energies of the natural world, so that we can see that we really are mutually dependent, and there is no such thing as the human beings over here and the natural world over here, that there is a a deep synergy that has always been present and never been broken. And it's only been ignored and missed
Amen.
somehow. So.
Amen. Well, also, I find that in addition to being a contemplative, I'm also a permaculturist. So I've studied the science of how do we redesign human, homesteads so that we are in relationship with the natural world in a way that's harmonious. And I have been teaching permaculture to faith communities up and down the Eastern Seaboard. We have resilience hubs forming in the Carolinas and also up here in the state of New York. Also one in Dallas that's getting ready to jump off soon. So those are the locations where my knowledge goes. But what does that mean in terms of being the divine feminine? Well, I say that when we plant according to the curvaceous contours of the land, rather than planting in rows, we're honoring the divine feminine. Nature doesn't do anything in a straight line. Okay, so, and that design is what creates sustainable abundance that requires no watering and no fertilizing. Okay, and this gives us food abundance, and we know that food abundance undergirds peace. Okay, so this is how, those principles being applied to how we interact with the land impacts our political realities. The divine feminine shows up in daily cycles, in seasonal cycles, and yearly cycles. And when humans follow those cycles, then all of us have rest, rejuvenation, and restoration built into our work. Okay, so what does that mean? It means following the divine feminine prevents and removes burnout. And I'm sure all of us could use a strong dose of that kind of preventative medicine. And it's free. That's the beautiful part about it. Now, the divine feminine for me showed up in a very surprising way when I was working on some family land in Virginia. I discovered that there's actually like a mathematical formula, a natural mathematical formula for the number of people required to perform an earth-given task. I discovered consistently something that took me 2 hours to do by myself. When I added just one person to help me, it consistently took 20 minutes. It just shrunk, and that happened so consistently. I said, oh my gosh, nature requires joyful encounter. Okay, if you want to have abundant yields, if you want to have joyful work, you need to build in community. You cannot do it by yourself. I think our ancestors knew this when they played drums in the field prior to slavery. And they also knew it when they sang songs being enslaved on this land. So joyful encounter needs to be put back into the way we interact with the land. Again, separating, well, now we're going to have entertainment and now we're going to farm. No, put them together. I even discovered there were dances that I learned in the African dance studio that, excuse me? The dances that I learned explicitly measured, if I performed them in the field, it measured the plants perfectly for how they needed to be put in the field. Okay, so there was a relationship between the human body and how the plants go into the land. And I think going back to the, our text, when we plant by the moon, or even we follow the Easter calendar, we're tapping into the divine feminine as a natural cycle of rebirth. The divine feminine shows up in meditation when we center in our heart space and we really saturate our thoughts with the anointing that comes from living in your heart. There's actually gray matter in the heart. So the heart technically can think. And the Eastern cultures that produced the Bible, that produced the Quran, that produced the Torah, they understood that. There was no separation from the presence of God, the heart and the mind. The ancients, there was no war between the mind and the heart. And so this is a different way that these texts are interpreted today. And so we need to understand that originally the divine feminine and that integration was there. I know for myself, I drink in the energy of nature whenever I'm unable to shift. And I find my emotions just really lift whenever I'm basking in nature, even if it's just a city tree, just holding it in my breath, holding it in my presence. That's how the divine nature, divine feminine shows up for me in nature. I first saw that the divine feminine was needed when I began climate work, because I saw that activists were acting on behalf of Earth, but they didn't have a personal relationship with Earth. And therefore, you hear a lot of despair and a lot of, losing hope. And that's because they're not connected to that natural abundance. They're not connected to the natural calming presence that comes with that relationship. There's no way you can see the abundance of nature and be despaired about our situation. I think the divine feminine in nature is needed to give us policies that restore Earth. We need the divine feminine to fund land-based work, okay? Because there's been a disconnect there. When we garden, we gain intimate knowledge of Earth's regenerative powers, and this strengthens our confidence that we can fix this mess that we've created. A regenerative agriculture means there's also a regenerative economy. So our financial system is fixed also. When we get aligned with the energy of regeneration, I really believe we can dissolve the climate crisis in our policies. And then finally, this is something I've been preaching about or speaking for a long time. I realized that Mother Nature's voice has to be intentionally inserted into the environmental justice narrative, just for the sake of integrity. We know that Martin Luther King Jr. spoke of environmental concerns, but he didn't speak of Mother Nature herself. So I'm thinking, where is the justice in silencing the one you are working to protect? How is it that you're just kicking Mother Nature to the curb? It's, oh no, Mom, we got this. We got, you sit down, you be quiet. And we're gonna do, we got all the answers. We know what we're doing. Mom, be quiet, be quiet. Really? I don't think there's any justice in kicking Mother Nature to the curb in an environmental movement that's supposed to protect nature. And so that's food for thought for all of us. Do we even know the difference between the human voice and Mother Nature's voice? And so for that, I think we want to open it up for questions, comments.
That's an invitation, folks. So feel free to speak up, or Rev Dele and Lama Liz, maybe you look through the chat and see if there's anything.
I do see a question in the chat.
Okay.
But
I was just going to say, when I was listening to a lot of this, I was thinking of Leopold's quotation about, and it's come through many different traditions, that you cannot protect what you do not love, and you cannot love what you do not know, and you cannot know without interreacting and being part of nature and spending time in nature. And he also said, when you become more ecologically aware, which would be the divine presence, you live in a world of wounds that nobody else can see. And I think that's part of it too, that you carry a sorrow of Mother Nature with you. And I see that like in the Overstory, the new Pulitzer Prize, coming from the position of the trees and the damage. That book ended on a very negative note, and I was saying this to Adam, that it didn't talk about the blessed unrest of people working in regenerative agriculture and permaculture and coming from more of a respect. So I guess I also want to say that I think there is a sorrow that we will compassionately carry with us with this love.
Absolutely. Liz, there's a question here. It says, speak more specifically about the links you see between the tantric view of the world,
Tantric,
reality.
yeah.
Tantric. Okay, the spell, I can't see it.
And emerging insights of science, right? I'm
Okay.
struck by how modern biology has moved increasingly into a description of the natural world as reciprocal, symbiotic, and collaborative rather than competitive. And that's certainly one of the areas in which there's a tremendous amount of crossover. So from the point of view of the modern biology, also from the point of view of, you could say, modern physics, there have been a lot of studies that are being done these days out of the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where meditators are being put into put electrodes or put on their heads, and they're being asked to meditate, especially experienced. Well, they work with both beginning meditators and experienced meditators to see how meditation practices, and there are many different kinds of meditation practices, but how meditation practices actually can shift and change and alter brain waves and bring them more into alignment with the kinds of energies that we see in the natural world. And on top of that, even there are studies in modern physics, where and this is very simplistic, I don't have a great handle on this particular area of literature, but that when we look into this, really break down the forms that we see and experience, that we start to see that really what we find at the very base is emptiness, that you can't find any truly existing particle of some kind that cannot be further dissolved and broken down. And this is the same kind of realization that many tantric practitioners or meditators have come to through some of these yogic practices, where the idea that one is in a constant exchange, that oneself is a body of energy that is continuously evolving and changing and is continuously exchanging energy with everything that it is in contact with, to the point where there is really no separation between what we think of as this separated human situation and the wider world, that we, in some sense, there can be a direct experience of that level of interconnectedness, where beyond the cellular level even, you find that there is there's no difference, there's no separation, there's only beingness, oneness, togetherness. And again, this is a little hard to put into words, but this is the sort of realization that modern physics is coming to, that was actually understood by some of these tantric yogis and yoginis, who then developed particular kinds of meditation techniques that enable other practitioners to begin to come to those same levels of realization as direct experience, rather than just as ideas. But I would just recommend, if you're interested in more of this kind of research, that you might look into the work of Richard Davies from University of Wisconsin-Madison, and also into the work that's being done by this, the group or the organization Mind and Life. And there are many different studies that you can find on the Mind and Life website that are exploring these interconnections between Vajrayana Buddhism, Tantric Buddhism, Buddhism meditation, and the natural world, the modern world. So please feel free to take a look in those areas.
This is Jim Laurie. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
I study symbiosis a lot, and the idea of saying that evolution is more about symbiosis between species than about competition. But I would like to also say, as we learn more about quantum theory, we're learning that it's very hard to measure things as humans, but birds can navigate using the quantum organs in their eyes, that they can see the magnetic fields. Trees can't do photosynthesis without quantum processing, that essentially an electron has to be able to go into several different directions at once. And the third one is our sense of smell is also a quantum process. That nature's been using quantum mechanics for about 2 billion years at least. And so our minds are trying to get our heads around it. But if we you know, we're going to be learning a lot about how we're all interconnected, I believe. So.
Well, and
I like
exactly that kind of realization is the sort of thing that these practitioners have come to through their own direct experience in terms of working with the five senses, which are intimately connected with the five elements and these elemental energies of the divine feminine. So I'm thrilled to hear you say that. Thank you.
I also want to bring up that the African mystics also have a spiritual practice that deals with those five senses. And instead of, you talk about the desert mothers and fathers that are at the beginning of again, the Abrahamic traditions, you're talking about people who didn't necessarily feel the need to isolate their cosmic experience from their daily life. And so they brought that understanding, that intensified smell, the intensified sight, the intensified hearing, they brought it into their daily work life. And so again, that's why you don't have bodies of literature on it, because it was already integrated. This is how you lived life. And so you have cultures that don't have words for what is art. What do you mean, what is art? That's we live, you know, what, so we have to look at the fact that some of these our religious traditions began with this understanding, and then as the, you know, like in telephone, as the word got passed along to, you know, other people, that connectedness was lost. I want to remind us that we can't even see 95% of reality. The human eye can only see 5% of what exists. Right. So for us to think that we can have all the answers in any situation is a little ridiculous. I do want to respond to a question that was in the chat. One of my Facebook buddies, Neil Dale, he wanted to talk about a little bit more about the difference or the similarity between the human voice and the voice of Mother Nature. And the reason I bring that up is because when we talk about solutions for our climate crisis, we typically are talking about human actions, and not just human actions in nature. We're usually talking about human actions in the market system, you know, another concept that we've created that is not connected to nature. We're talking about policies that, again, are not related to natural rhythms. So the voice of Mother Nature is spoken through her elements. You know, water flows. You know, the air. I don't even know that we have a lot of words for how the air moves. You know, the air blows. So, and oftentimes when we are in very professional and very academic settings, we're not allowed to use that language that evokes the heart. You know, the warmth of the sun, the radiant beauty. That has a meaning on a variety of levels. You know, radiation penetrates the ethers. But we're not really allowed to talk about that as it relates to how we go through our daily life. We're taught these days to segment everything, to isolate. We've created like a monoculture of language. So only certain kinds of language can be used to talk about certain sorts of things. And so to insert the voice of Mother Nature, we need to bring that emotive, the flowing, the impromptu, the intuitive, all of those aspects of nature that we can't control. And we have to allow that language to guide our policies and our behavior. And what it's going to do, it's going to take us out of these human-built environments, and it's going to put us directly back in touch with nature. And for some reason, we're resisting that. We're resisting going back to nature. As if
I would like to say something before the time is over. And that is that as a Quaker, I have had a number of experiences that cannot be confined in language, and they're central to my existence. They're central to who I am. I've also spent a lot of time talking with people about the problems that we've inherited by deciding that God is male. And to try and weed out that language from Quaker texts. I am currently in an argument with people in Quaker Earth Care Witness because I think we need to do the same thing with female language. I think we're doing ourselves the same exact mirror image of disservice when we say Mother Nature and Mother Earth. I think that we're going along with some sort of poorly articulated thing in our own heads about what male is and what female is. And I can go along with almost all of what the two of you have been saying without using that language. And I'm very strong on this. I had to kick my husband out of the kitchen just now so that I could unmute and say this. But because I would like to see this be part of our discussion and not just take it for granted that we are all in unity about Mother Nature, Mother Earth, and all that stuff. To me, we're going to go much further if we try to get to the same places without using gendered language. Thank you.
That's a wonderful conversation to continue at 1:30.
Thank you. And in order to get to 1:30, I think we need to give people a few minutes to eat. So this was a great discussion. I loved it. And I'm sure you will reconvene with many people at 1:30. And at 12:30, we have a real treat with Jim Laurie, our staff scientist, and his remarkable crew of homeschoolers who are digging into science and life on Earth way before they're supposed to, according to the formal education system. But in marvelous ways, they've spoken to us in their various different groups over the past 4 or 5 years at our conferences, and it's a tradition that we really treasure and want to continue. So join us again at 12:30, and we will reconvene. And thank you, everybody, very much.